The keys hit the glass tabletop with a sharp, metallic crack that seemed to echo through the whole house. For a moment, all I heard was my own heartbeat, thudding somewhere between my ears and my throat. A cold silence fell across the living room. So pristine, so expensive, it felt like standing in a luxury car showroom, not a home. The kind of place where everything shined except the people in it. Ethan didn't even look at me as he paced in front of the bay window. His shoes clicked against the hardwood. Steady, impatient, like he was late for a meeting he didn't want to attend. You could almost see the tension rolling off him. That mix of annoyance and disdain I'd seen creeping into his voice for years, but never quite believed. Maybe it was the suit. He always wore black now, even at home. Too polished, too tight. Like he was trying to convince himself he belonged in a life he'd only inherited. I stood in the foyer, one hand on my suitcase, the other gripping the doorknob for balance. At 62, I'd spent 3 decades building everything this house stood on. Late nights in the loading docks, endless overtime, every last dollar tucked into college accounts and mortgage payments. I never pictured it would come to this. Certainly not on a cold, gray Thursday, with the air outside thick as dirty dishwater and the rain just starting to rattle the windows. "You really want to do this, Dad?" Ethan finally stopped moving. His eyes met mine. Not even a flicker of warmth. "Because we're done here. You got your years, you got your chance to feel needed. But we're not kids anymore. You need to get out, and you need to get out now." He said it like he was giving a statement to a cop, not talking to his father. I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. Every apology I'd rehearsed, every story about how hard things had been after Linda died, stuck somewhere in my chest and refused to move. Maybe he saw it, maybe he just didn't care. Behind him, Lila perched on the edge of the cream sofa, tapping her manicured nails against her phone. She didn't even look up. The smell of her perfume hung in the air, sharp, synthetic. A scent that didn't belong here. Not with the faded family photos still stuck to the fridge in the kitchen. She didn't say much, just a quick, cool, "Let's not drag this out, Michael." Her voice was soft, controlled, the kind of tone you use when you're ending a business call and want everyone to remember who's in charge. "You know what's best for everyone." 100 memories flashed through my mind at once. Ethan at age 7, hair matted from the rain, clinging to my neck at Linda's funeral. Lila's first Thanksgiving here, back before her job at the agency started swallowing her whole. Even the way the sun used to spill into the living room on Sunday mornings, when I was still allowed to believe this house meant family. That all seemed like a story someone else had lived. Now, there was nothing left but the sting in my chest, the taste of iron on my tongue, and 1,000 unsaid things. The words, "You're nothing to us," hung between us, ugly and raw. I wanted to scream, to smash the perfect glass, to ask them what happened to the people I loved. But I didn't. I just held on tighter to the suitcase handle. The door loomed behind me, heavy as a gravestone. Outside, rain tapped out a steady beat against the driveway. No one moved. I heard the tick of Lila's phone as she typed out something, probably texting Ethan's sister to tell her the problem was handled. The house felt smaller than it ever had. Every light too bright, every shadow too sharp. "I hope you understand, Dad." Ethan's voice had softened, but it was all for show. "We can't keep doing this. You're holding us back." That was the part that cut the deepest. Not the eviction, not the silence, but that sentence. As if I'd spent my whole life holding him back, not carrying him. The idea that everything I'd sacrificed, all the overtime, every night I'd sat awake worrying about tuition, about groceries, about the mortgage. None of it mattered. To him, I was just a burden that refused to leave quietly. I saw my reflection in the hall mirror. Lined face, tired eyes, shoulders rounded by too many years hauling other people's problems. A raincoat 2 sizes too big, bought at Target because it was on sale. I looked like every old man you see standing in line at the DMV, invisible and in the way. But then my hand brushed the inside pocket of my coat and I felt it. A single sheet of paper, yellowed at the edges, folded and refolded so many times the creases were soft as fabric. I carried it for years. Not a will, not a love letter, just a contract. A promise I made to myself a long time ago, back when I still believed families stuck together no matter what. Something shifted. Maybe it was the rain. Maybe it was the taste of their contempt finally settling in my mouth. Instead of begging, I nodded, just once, and stepped toward the door. For a second, Lila's eyes flickered. Maybe she thought I was going to collapse. Maybe she wanted me to, but I didn't. I turned the knob, felt the cool metal bite into my palm, and let the heavy oak swing open. The rush of cold air made my skin prickle. Behind me, the lights cast long shadows across the entryway. "You're wrong about me," I said, voice low, steady. "But you'll figure that out soon enough." I didn't look back. I walked out into the rain, suitcase bumping against my leg, the taste of loss burning in my mouth. For a moment, I just stood there, letting the water soak my hair, drip down my collar, slide into my shoes. If any neighbors were watching, they'd see nothing but a soggy old man who finally lost his last fight. Let them whisper. They'd whispered before, back when Linda got sick, back when I worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on, back when Ethan nearly flunked out of college and I drove all night to bail him out. No one ever saw the years you spend keeping a family together. They only notice when you finally let go. The cab I called was late. I stood beneath the streetlight, the suitcase feeling heavier than it should, the paper burning a hole in my pocket. Every minute out here, every step away from that house, felt like walking deeper into a story that wasn't finished yet. By the time the cab arrived, a dented yellow Ford, still sticky with the smell of old coffee, I'd made a decision. No tears, no begging. The story wasn't over. Not for me. As the city lights blurred past the window, I kept one hand in my pocket, my thumb tracing the soft, worn edge of the contract. It was more than paper. It was a secret. My secret. The world thought I was done, washed up, left to rot in some cheap apartment on the wrong side of Columbus. Let them. Because even as the rain hammered the taxi roof, even as the driver squinted at me in the mirror, I felt something rising in my chest. A quiet, stubborn fire, the kind that kept me alive all those years when hope was the only thing I could afford. They thought I'd disappear. They thought they could erase me. But people like me, we don't vanish. We bide our time. The city melted away behind us, and I looked at the contract one more time. The first line was faded, the signature barely visible, but I remembered every word. It was more than just legal jargon. It was a lifeline. And as I pressed my forehead against the cold glass, I realized I was already planning my next move. I smiled then, just a small, private thing. Not the smile of a man who's beaten, but the kind you see on someone who knows something you don't. Because sometimes the end is just the beginning. And the real story, the one no one's expecting, the one you'll remember long after the rain stops, was about to unfold. Some things break in silence with no sound at all. The apartment Ethan and Lila thought I'd crawl away to wasn't much to look at. Just a tiny box above a nail salon on the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio. The kind of place where your neighbors argue through the walls and the only window faced a battered billboard for a pawn shop. It wasn't home. It wasn't supposed to be. It was just where you landed when you ran out of places to go. The first morning I woke up there, the sun was just a hazy stripe through the blinds, catching dust in the air. I sat up, knees aching, back stiff, and stared around at the bare walls. The plastic lamp I'd bought for $5 at the thrift store, the suitcase still unopened in the corner. The silence was so thick you could almost touch it. I'd never been good at being alone. The years after Linda died, even when Ethan was a teenager and rarely spoke, at least I had his music blaring from down the hall, the sound of video games at 2 a.m., the thud of his footsteps racing out the door to some party or other. You miss things you never expected to miss, like slammed doors, arguments, or the way he used to come home smelling like fast food and cheap cologne. Now it was just me, an empty coffee mug, and the echo of his words rattling around the room. Maybe I deserved it. Maybe I should have seen it coming. That's what people said when a family blew apart, right? You should have seen it coming. I remembered every time I tried to say no to him and failed. The way he called from college, voice all shaky and desperate, needing money for rent, for books, for anything at all. How I'd work triple shifts at the Miller Distribution Center, skipping meals, skipping sleep, skipping every last hope of doing something for myself, just to wire him the cash. The pride when he graduated, the photo on the fridge of him in his cap and gown, his mother's smile ghosting through his eyes for a moment. Back then, I believed every sacrifice would come back to me. That's what dads are supposed to believe, I guess. That's what keeps you breathing. But time has a way of rewriting the past. In the gray light of that first week, I picked up the only photo I'd brought from the house. Linda in her old blue dress, standing in the kitchen with Ethan on her hip, flower on her cheek, laughing like there was no such thing as a mortgage, no such thing as death or betrayal. I set it on the table next to my mug so I wouldn't feel so alone. The first thing I did after unpacking my shirts was tape a piece of paper over the cracked window to keep out the wind. The second was put the yellowed contract in the top drawer of my nightstand, wrapped in the flannel shirt Linda used to steal from my closet on cold nights. Every morning, I forced myself into a new routine. Make the instant coffee, walk down 3 flights of stairs to the street, nod at Mrs. Tang opening the nail shop, pick up the free newspaper at the corner store, pretend I was still part of the world. Some days, the ache in my chest was worse than others. It wasn't just about losing a home or pride or a son. It was about the hollowed-out feeling of not being needed. I tried watching TV, but the laugh tracks made the place feel emptier. I walked for hours, circling blocks lined with boarded-up diners and shuttered hardware stores, just to tire myself out enough to sleep. The first real crack came one afternoon, sitting in the corner booth of a faded diner 2 blocks from the apartment, pushing cold eggs around a chipped plate. A group of men my age argued in the next booth about the price of gas and the Reds' losing streak. Their voices buzzed in my ears, but it was the ache in my hands that got to me. Old, working hands, scarred from a lifetime of hard labor and broken promises. I remembered Ethan's little fingers gripping mine the night after Linda's funeral. How he wouldn't sleep unless I was right there. How he used to say, "Don't go, Dad, just for tonight." Every night after, I told myself I'd never let him feel abandoned. Never let him think he wasn't loved, no matter what. Funny how you can make a promise like that and still end up alone. Anyway, on the walk back, the wind carried the smell of rain and fried chicken from somewhere up the street. A police cruiser passed, lights off, slow, like it was hunting for trouble that hadn't happened yet. I watched my reflection slide past in the pawn shop window. A tired man in a cheap jacket, face more lines than flesh, eyes that didn't match the boy Linda had married. I didn't recognize myself, but maybe that was the point. I passed a church on 7th, the bell tolling noon, and ducked inside just to escape the cold. There were a few old women in the pews, heads bowed over rosaries, a kid at the altar pretending to pray. I sat in the back, not really sure if I believed in anything anymore. I thought of Linda's faith, how she'd light candles for strangers and say every little thing was part of a bigger plan. I wanted to believe her, but all I could feel was the weight of that contract in my pocket, a lifeline or a curse, depending on the day. That night, I took the paper out, ran my thumb over the faded ink, and read it again for the 100th time. The terms were clear, but the meaning was muddier than ever. I'd signed over the house to Ethan, thinking it was an act of love, of trust. But there was a clause, a technicality, a line neither of us had noticed until it was too late. The truth was, on paper I still had a stake. A forgotten detail, but maybe the only thing left tying me to the life I'd lost. It wasn't hope, not exactly. More like the last card you keep up your sleeve when you've lost everything else. The weeks dragged. Rent ate at my savings. The calls from debt collectors started. I learned to ignore the phone, learned to sleep through the sirens and shouting from the street below. My hands shook sometimes when I tried to write a grocery list. I thought of calling Ethan, just to hear his voice, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Pride is a hard thing to swallow when you're hungry. Instead, I started haunting the local library. It was the only place I could go where the heat worked and no one looked twice at a man with nowhere to be. The librarian, a woman about my age with silver hair and the gentle hands of someone who'd lived through her own heartbreaks, smiled at me every time I came in. I started reading about property law, estate planning, legal loopholes. I didn't know what I was looking for at first, just needed to feel like I was doing something, anything to claw back a sense of purpose. After a few days, the librarian slipped a book onto my table, not saying a word, just giving me that look people give when they know you're holding on by a thread. Her name tag read Margot. That small kindness got to me in a way nothing else had for weeks. The more I read, the more I realized how thin the line was between justice and revenge. Maybe I was a fool, thinking a piece of paper could heal 30 years of love and damage. But every night, I found myself sitting by the window, contract in hand, heart pounding as I traced the signature, imagining all the ways it might still mean something. I started scribbling notes on the back of grocery receipts, timelines and names and what-ifs, piecing together a plan I barely understood myself. One afternoon, as the wind rattled the glass and the smell of rain crept in, Margot sat down across from me, 2 coffees in hand. We didn't talk about the past. We didn't need to. There was a quiet understanding between people who've lost more than they can ever get back. She told me about her daughter, gone off to Los Angeles, too busy to call. I listened, grateful to not be the only one left behind. It was Margot who saw what I'd missed. A single, overlooked line in the contract, a detail buried in the legalese that might give me the leverage I needed. Her eyes sparked with something like hope, or maybe mischief. For the first time in weeks, I felt something in my chest loosen, a knot untying itself in the quiet. I still missed Linda every night. I still caught myself setting out 2 coffee mugs in the morning, still looked for Ethan's shoes by the door. But slowly, a new rhythm started to settle in. I started sleeping a little better, eating a little more, dreaming, God help me, of a day when all this pain might actually mean something. I wasn't sure if I wanted my old life back, or if I just wanted the power to choose for myself again. Maybe there was no difference. The last thing I did each night was check the contract, make sure it was still there, still real, still mine. I didn't know what was coming, but I knew I was done waiting for someone else to tell me what my life was worth. There are 1,000 ways to lose a family. There might only be one way to get justice. In the half-light of that tiny apartment, surrounded by memories and debts, I started to believe in that way just a little. I started to believe in myself again, too. By the time the first real snow settled over Columbus, the ache in my bones had become familiar, like the steady hum of the fridge in my apartment. Always there, always half ignored. I had gotten used to loneliness, or so I told myself, moving through the world like a ghost with a grocery bag and a mind full of regrets. There were days when the silence felt almost peaceful, as if time itself had agreed to leave me alone for a little while, to let me drift. Other days, it pressed in from all sides until I almost missed the chaos I'd left behind. But the strange thing about being alone is that you start to see your own life differently. The anger faded just enough to make room for sharper questions. Did I do this to myself? Did Ethan turn cold because I sheltered him too long? Or was there a moment, one single stupid moment, when I should have said no but didn't? Those thoughts circled in my head as I shuffled through the library's double doors, the ones that stuck a little in the winter, always letting in a breath of cold air that cut through your clothes and right into your skin. I'd begun to treat the public library on 12th like my second home, my private bunker. The regulars nodded as I passed, as if we were all members of some club no one wanted to join. I settled at my usual table in the corner, near the radiator that clanked and hissed whenever someone adjusted the thermostat up front. I pulled out my notebook, the yellowed contract, a battered copy of Ohio Real Estate Law Margot had recommended, and a stack of loose receipts covered in my scribbled handwriting. There was something both comforting and humiliating about starting from scratch. Each page I turned felt like one more reminder of all the things I'd never learned when I was younger, how to protect what I loved, how to spot the traps before I stepped into them. The words on the page swam in and out of focus, but I forced myself to read them anyway. If I didn't, I'd drown in memories. Margot appeared like a ghost across from me, her gray hair pulled back, her eyes sharp and thoughtful. She didn't bother with pleasantries anymore. We had our own quiet shorthand by now. She slid a thick legal pad between us, her handwriting a careful, looping script that looked nothing like the scrawl of my old life. We talked in hushed tones, heads close, our voices blending with the library's steady hum. She was the one who found the loophole, the clause in the transfer paperwork Ethan had overlooked, the one that could unravel everything he'd built on my back. A missed signature, a notary error. Small things, the sort of things people trust lawyers to catch. But this time, luck was on my side. Margot's finger traced the line, her voice steady and low as she explained what it meant, what it could mean if I played my cards right. The world shifted beneath me, subtle but seismic. The possibility was there, fragile but real. I wasn't out of moves yet. It wasn't just the contract, though. Margot's curiosity and quiet empathy pushed me in other ways. She urged me to dig deeper, to look into Ethan's business dealings, to pay attention to the patterns I'd missed for years. Late-night phone calls, sudden trips, unexplained deposits and bank statements I'd never asked about until it was too late. I felt like an intruder in my own son's life, piecing together a puzzle I didn't even know existed. Still, every discovery tightened the knot in my gut. What started as a hunt for justice became something closer to obsession. Every night, I scoured public records, scanned social media, followed digital breadcrumbs I would have laughed at a year ago. There were hints of trouble, disgruntled clients, whispers of mismanaged funds, reviews posted and quickly deleted. I took notes on everything. Some nights, I barely slept, haunted by the sense that every answer only led to more questions. Margot kept me grounded, kept my focus sharp, kept reminding me that I wasn't crazy to feel betrayed. One afternoon, as icy rain painted streaks across the library windows, I stumbled across something that changed the tenor of everything. An anonymous review on a business forum accused Ethan's company of artificially inflating property values, manipulating appraisals, and burying the evidence in a maze of shell accounts. I read it 3 times, hands shaking, my breath stuck somewhere between anger and disbelief. It was the kind of thing you only hear about in news stories, never at your own kitchen table, never with your son's name attached. Margot and I met at a corner table in the diner that evening, her coat dusted with snow, a file folder thick with printouts under her arm. We sorted through evidence together, laying out timelines, connecting dots, drinking bad coffee until the waitress glared at us for taking up space. There was a new energy in me, a current that hummed beneath my skin, part fear, part purpose. I wondered if this was what hope felt like after it had been kicked around too long to shine. As the days blurred into weeks, my suspicion grew into certainty. Ethan wasn't just cold, he was reckless, maybe even dangerous. There was a cold calculation in the way he moved money, the way he pushed people aside. I could see it now, every misstep laid bare. It hurt, but it also steeled me. I tried to remember the boy who used to fall asleep in my lap, the one who clung to my hand at Linda's funeral. I couldn't see him in the man who'd thrown me out. Not anymore. What scared me wasn't that Ethan had changed, but that I hadn't seen it happening. Maybe I'd refused to see it. Margot was the first to ask the question I'd been avoiding. What happens if you win? Her voice was soft, but there was steel beneath it. I stared at the papers, at my hands, at the scar on my knuckle from fixing the back fence with Ethan when he was 12. What did I want? Revenge? Redemption? A chance to start over? I didn't know. All I knew was that I couldn't let this slide. The library became our war room. I'd arrive before the doors opened, nervous energy humming through me as I waited in the cold with my notes and folders. The staff got used to seeing us there, nodding as we huddled over legal pads and stacks of old property deeds. We whispered strategies, sometimes laughing at the absurdity of it all. A retired warehouse worker and a widowed librarian, plotting against a real estate firm with more lawyers than clients. But we weren't powerless. I started to see that. Margot had connections, a cousin at the city clerk's office, a friend at a local newspaper, a former neighbor who remembered when Ethan's company first started raising eyebrows. We made calls, sent emails, left anonymous tips. Each move was calculated, cautious, but it felt good to act. For the first time since Ethan slammed that door, I felt less like a victim, more like a contender. The tension built quietly, like storm clouds stacking up beyond the city skyline. Some nights, I lay awake and imagined all the ways this could end. Good, bad, everything in between. The weight of every decision pressed against my chest. There were moments when I wanted to quit, to let it all go. But every time I pictured Linda's smile, or heard Margot's quiet encouragement, I found a little more strength. I didn't tell anyone else what I was doing. This fight belonged to me and the small circle of people who hadn't given up on me yet. Sometimes I wondered what Ethan would say if he knew, if he'd laugh or threaten or just stare with that icy detachment I still didn't understand. But deep down, I realized I didn't care anymore. I wasn't doing this to teach him a lesson, not really. I was doing it to save what little was left of myself. On a gray morning in late February, with snow melting into dirty rivers along the sidewalk, Margot handed me a new stack of evidence. An unsigned letter from a former employee of Ethan's company, a spreadsheet that didn't add up, a contract with my name still listed as an owner. My hands trembled as I sorted through the papers. The path was clear now, the way forward shining through the fog of loss. As I left the library, the city looked different, brighter somehow. Maybe it was just the relief of knowing I still had a shot. Maybe it was the knowledge that I'd chosen not to vanish. I walked home with my coat pulled tight against the wind, my heart beating with a mix of fear and defiance. Margot called that evening, her voice warm, almost proud. "You're not done yet, Michael. You're just getting started." I sat at the window long after the call ended, watching the city lights flicker to life, each one a promise that tomorrow would come, no matter what. For the first time in months, I believed it. Planning revenge isn't what you think it is. It isn't loud or explosive or cinematic. Most of the time, it's just hours in a small, silent room, your heart thumping in your chest while you sort through evidence and doubts. That's where I found myself, day after day, with Margot beside me, our hands trembling sometimes as we realized what this meant. Not just for Ethan, but for both of us. The air in my apartment was stale and smelled faintly of dust, the window letting in the sound of distant traffic and nothing else. I had stopped noticing the draft months ago. I'd stopped noticing a lot of things. Margot's legal pad was full of neat columns and arrows, connecting Ethan's business with numbers that didn't add up, linking bank deposits to names I barely recognized. Her voice was steady as she laid it all out, methodical and patient, even when my own resolve wavered. She never seemed afraid of what we might find, and maybe that courage was contagious. She told me once, quietly, that the hardest part of fighting for yourself is realizing you're worth the fight. I remembered that every time I hesitated, but I was scared, more than I let on. It was one thing to know the truth, to sense in your bones that your son wasn't the man you thought he was. It was another to stare at the hard proof, contracts, forged signatures, money funneling through ghost accounts. It made my skin crawl to see Ethan's name there, inked next to words like fraud and embezzlement. It would have been easier, in some ways, if I could have just kept hating him. Instead, every fact I uncovered felt like a bruise that wouldn't heal, another reminder of what we'd both lost. Margot said we needed leverage, and I knew she was right. If we just went to the authorities, Ethan would spin the story his way, bury us in lawyers and PR statements. We needed to time everything. An anonymous tip here, a leaked document there, a nudge to a journalist who remembered when the city still cared about the truth. I took careful notes, my pen digging grooves into the pages. I learned patience the hard way. The more I waited, the more I watched, the more cracks I saw in Ethan's empire. The apartment became a bunker, the air thick with conspiracy and hope. Margot brought takeout sometimes, setting down paper bags on my wobbly kitchen table, and we'd eat in silence, hunched over printouts and receipts. Every so often, I caught her glancing at the faded photo of Linda I taped above the light switch. She never asked, but I could feel her questions hovering. I wasn't sure I could answer them anyway. Our plan grew sharper by the week. First, I drafted a letter, anonymous but precise, outlining everything I'd discovered about Ethan's business dealings. Margot's contacts made sure it reached the right set of eyes in City Hall. Next, we filed a formal complaint with the Ohio State Real Estate Board, naming not just Ethan but two of his closest partners, the men I remembered from backyard barbecues and Christmas parties, the same ones who used to call me sir and thank me for the extra beer. I wondered what they'd say now, reading my accusations. I started sleeping with the contract under my pillow, my old superstition from years of hiding cash from landlords and bill collectors. It was more than paper, it was a lifeline, a shield. Margot said we'd use it only if Ethan tried to bury us. She showed me how to file for an injunction, how to subpoena records, how to protect myself from countersuits. She did it all in a calm, measured tone, but I could see the worry in her eyes. It was one thing to plan a war. It was another to know the enemy knew your name. Ethan must have sensed something. He called one afternoon from a number I didn't recognize, his voice tight, all forced politeness and shallow concern. I could hear Lila in the background, her laughter brittle and bright. I almost hung up, but Margot shook her head, and I stayed on the line. He danced around the subject, asking about my health, the apartment, if I needed money. I knew it was an act. I let him talk, every word tightening the knot in my chest. When I hung up, Margot said it was a good sign. He was nervous, not in control. That made two of us. We spent the next week laying low. Margot started parking her car on the next block, just in case. I stopped answering the door unless I recognized the knock. One night, I spotted a man in a black coat standing across the street, his phone held to his ear, eyes flicking up to my window and away. Maybe I was paranoid. Maybe not. Margot said it was normal to feel hunted, that the people in power never went quietly. I wondered how many times she'd fought a battle like this. When the official letter from the board arrived, it was thin and formal, but my hands shook as I slit the envelope. They were launching a preliminary investigation. Margot read it twice, then folded it neatly, her mouth pressed into a thin line. I waited for relief, but all I felt was dread. It wasn't over. It was just beginning. I started to see Ethan and Lila everywhere. Their faces were on bus stop ads, real estate flyers, even on the side of a city bus that roared past as I crossed Main one morning. Their smiles were too bright, too perfect, a mask I used to believe in. I felt like a stranger in my own city, the ground shifting beneath me with every step. Margot told me not to lose focus, and I tried to listen. We mapped out the timeline, gathered affidavits, even found a disgruntled former client willing to speak out. I listened to their stories, the way Ethan's company had promised the world and delivered nothing but headaches. I wondered how many people had been hurt while I was too busy trying to save my own family. The morning we filed the lawsuit was bitterly cold. I wore my best shirt, the one Linda bought for my birthday years ago, the fabric gone thin at the cuffs. Margot squeezed my hand as we handed the paperwork to the clerk. It felt surreal, standing in that bland office, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, while the rest of the city went on without a clue. I wanted to run, to forget the whole thing, but I stood my ground. I owed Linda that much. That afternoon, I caught a glimpse of myself in a store window. Shoulders squared, jaw set, eyes sharper than I remembered. I looked like a man who'd stopped waiting for someone else to save him. We watched the news every night, searching for mention of Ethan's firm, for rumors, for any hint that our efforts were working. First, there was nothing. Then, a trickle, a story about real estate fraud in the city, a quiet investigation, a mention of a source close to the matter. Margot's lips curled into a faint smile. I realized I was holding my breath. But it wasn't just us who were moving. Ethan's lawyers sent letters, threats, denials, requests to meet and resolve this amicably. Margot fielded the calls, her patience endless, her responses measured and cold. I tried not to think about how tired she looked, the way she rubbed her temples after long days, the way she avoided talking about her own family. We were both running out of time. There was a night when it all almost fell apart. Someone broke the lock on my door, left muddy boot prints on the carpet, rifled through drawers. Nothing taken, just chaos left behind. I called the police, filed a report, but I knew what it was. A warning, a message. Margot stayed on the phone with me all night, her voice soft and steady. In the darkness, I realized I wasn't afraid. I was angry. The next morning, I moved the contract to a safer place, scanned copies to 3 separate flash drives, mailed one to an old friend in Cleveland. Margot said it was smart. I just felt tired. But then the investigation went public. The paper ran a headline, "Real estate mogul under fire, sources claim widespread fraud." Ethan's picture was below it, eyes narrowed, smile thin. Lila's name was mentioned, her position at a marketing firm suddenly under scrutiny. It was all unraveling, faster than I dared to hope. I watched Ethan's life implode in slow motion, his calls becoming desperate, his emails veiled threats and pleading in equal measure. Margot said the hardest part was waiting for the other shoe to drop. I believed her. My days were filled with calls from lawyers, reporters, old friends who'd heard the news and wanted a piece of the story. I ignored most of them, focused on what mattered, seeing this through, honoring the promise I'd made to myself and to Linda. Sometimes I caught myself missing Ethan. Not the man he'd become, but the boy I'd once known. The pain was sharp, but I let it linger, kept me honest. Through it all, Margot never let me quit. She pushed me when I faltered, reminded me of every step we'd taken, every battle we'd already won. Her strength became mine. In the quiet moments when the world felt ready to cave in, I held on to that. I held on to the contract, to the truth, to the hope that maybe, just maybe, all of this would mean something. The city outside changed, but inside, the fight was still going. The last piece was falling into place, and I could feel it. A storm gathering on the horizon, inevitable, unstoppable. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what would come next. The day of the hearing, the world felt both smaller and impossibly wide, like the hours before a thunderstorm when you know something is about to break. I woke up before the sun, barely sleeping, running through every possible scenario, every answer and counterattack. My hands shook as I poured coffee, the cheap mug rattling on the chipped counter. Margot had called the night before, her voice low and calm, but underneath, I heard the nerves. She was as invested in this as I was now. There was no turning back. The city outside seemed indifferent. Traffic rushed, people hurried with their umbrellas, and for a moment I wondered if anyone else walking those wet sidewalks realized the stakes of what was happening that morning. I'd always thought justice was a quiet thing, slow and logical. I was wrong. Sometimes it comes crashing, and all you can do is brace yourself and hope you're strong enough to stand. Margot picked me up in her old Subaru. The heater barely worked, but the inside was clean, filled with the faint smell of coffee and peppermint gum. We didn't talk much on the drive. She gripped the wheel, her jaw set. I stared out the window, watching the city roll by. Old brick buildings, half-empty strip malls, the courthouse rising in the distance like a ship caught in a storm. My mind kept looping through memories. Ethan's first t-ball game, the day we signed the mortgage, the laughter at Linda's memorial service that had somehow felt like forgiveness. At the courthouse, the air was cold, sharp with the smell of rain and concrete. Inside, everything was too bright. White lights buzzing overhead, guards scanning bags, the steady thud of shoes on linoleum. The waiting area was already packed. I recognized one or two faces from Ethan's office, people who'd once shared barbecues and holidays with us. They looked away when they saw me, a subtle shame in their eyes. Or maybe that was just my imagination. I sat beside Margot, clutching the folder that held the original contract. My notes, my whole life. She squeezed my arm. I realized I hadn't felt a human touch that gentle in years. The doors opened. The courtroom filled fast. Ethan and Lila swept in, dressed like they'd stepped out of a magazine. Tailored suits, cool composure, smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Ethan wouldn't look at me. Lila did, just for a second, and then her gaze slid away, cold and empty. Their lawyers flanked them, all expensive shoes and perfect hair. Margot and I were outnumbered, outdressed, but I'd never felt stronger. There's a power in having nothing left to lose. The judge entered, a woman with steel-gray hair and a voice that could cut through stone. She laid out the rules, her tone brisk and clipped. The other side started first. Ethan's attorney, a man named Wallace, smooth and oily. He painted a picture of a bitter old man, desperate to reclaim the past, spinning wild tales to cover his own failures. I watched Ethan as Wallace spoke. His posture was perfect, but his hands kept twitching, fingers drumming against the table. Lila's jaw was clenched, her foot tapping beneath her chair. The cracks were showing. Then it was Margot's turn. She stood straight, voice calm but fierce. She walked the court through every step, how the contract had been mishandled, how the evidence showed clear misconduct, how every accusation was backed up with documentation and sworn testimony. I watched the faces in the room shift from bored to wary, saw even the judge's eyes narrow with interest. Margot held up the contract, the faded signature still visible. She handed it to the bailiff, who brought it to the bench. The judge read for a long time. The silence was thunderous. My heart pounded so loudly I wondered if anyone else could hear it. Ethan started to speak, but Wallace held him back. Lila stared at the floor, her nails digging into her palm. I thought of every night I'd lain awake, afraid of what would happen if I lost. Now, in this bright, unforgiving room, I wasn't afraid. I was angry, but it was a clean anger, focused, almost righteous. Margot had said once that justice doesn't always heal you, but it can give you the courage to keep living. I understood that now. Finally, the judge looked up. Her voice was low, deliberate. She acknowledged the mistakes in the property transfer, the mounting evidence of Ethan's fraud, the pattern of intimidation and retaliation. She said she'd never seen such carelessness from a firm of that size, and her gaze lingered on Ethan so long I saw him flinch. The ruling was swift. The house was still legally mine. The judge ordered an independent audit of Ethan's business and directed the board to launch a full review of his licenses. She dismissed their counterclaims, defamation, harassment, everything swept away. The room went still. For a moment, no one moved. Then Ethan stood, his face twisted in shock, his voice cracking as he tried to argue, to protest. The judge cut him off. Lila rose, her composure shattered, and pushed past him, tears streaking her perfect makeup. Wallace gathered his papers, muttering under his breath. It was over, or at least this part was. Margot hugged me outside the courtroom. The rain had stopped. The world felt cleaner, lighter. I stood on the courthouse steps, letting the air fill my lungs. The weight that had pressed down on me for years suddenly gone. People passed by, some with sympathy, some with curiosity. A few even smiled. I didn't know what would come next. Whether Ethan would try to rebuild, whether he'd ever understand what he'd lost. Maybe it didn't matter anymore. Ethan didn't speak to me as he left. He kept his eyes fixed on the sidewalk, shoulders hunched, his world caving in around him. I thought about calling out, telling him there was still time to change, to find his way back. But I stayed silent. Some things you have to let go. Margot and I walked together to her car. She handed me the contract, safe in its folder. We didn't need words. She understood. She always had. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the house quiet, every sound amplified by the emptiness. I poured a glass of whiskey, set the contract in front of me, and stared at the faded photo of Linda on the wall. There was a strange peace in that moment. Not joy exactly, and not the satisfaction of revenge, but something deeper. A sense of justice restored, of wrongs finally righted. The pain was still there, sharp and real, but I could live with it. I was free in a way I hadn't been for decades. I didn't sleep much. I watched the city lights from my window, listened to the distant sound of trains on the tracks, let myself dream of a future that belonged to me again. I wondered what Linda would say if she saw me now. I hoped she'd be proud. The next morning, the phone rang. News had spread, articles online, calls from old friends and distant cousins. Some wanted details, some just offered congratulations. I answered a few, let most go to voicemail. I wasn't ready for the world yet. I wanted to hold on to this victory a little longer, to savor it before the next storm rolled in. Margot stopped by with coffee, her eyes bright for the first time in weeks. We sat together, not saying much, just sharing the quiet. For the first time since all this began, I believed it was possible to move on, not just from Ethan, but from the weight of all the years that had shaped us. I was still grieving, still angry, still wounded. But I was alive, and that was enough. Justice isn't a finish line. It's the first step in learning to live with what's left. The day stretched ahead, full of new possibility, and for the first time in a long time, I was ready to walk into it. I never expected quiet to be so complicated. The house was mine again, yet it echoed now with a strange emptiness. There was no sense of victory, not really, just the slow unwinding of years lived under pressure. I spent the days after the ruling sorting through what remained. Boxes of old bills, forgotten gifts, Linda's recipe cards, photo albums yellowed at the edges. The house still smelled faintly of lemon oil and old dust, but somehow even that had faded. I walked through each room as if visiting the life of a stranger, fingers grazing over memories that no longer fit. The news about Ethan's business spread fast, faster than I'd thought possible. Local reporters circled, neighbors watched from behind curtains, old friends called to offer congratulations or apologies, or sometimes just silence. The city seemed smaller now, as if everyone had known more than they let on and only now felt safe to say it. I saw Ethan's face in the news, each headline a fresh reminder that some losses could never be made right. There was no pride in what I'd done, only relief that the bleeding had stopped, that for once, justice was heavier than blood. Margot stopped by often in those first days, bringing coffee and a little warmth, helping me pack up the rooms that still held pieces of Linda. She never pressed me to talk, never asked if I was okay. She understood that some grief couldn't be spoken, only endured. We'd sit at the old kitchen table, herself with her tea, me with a mug of whatever she'd brought, and sometimes just look out the window in silence. There was a comfort in that, a small reminder that survival didn't always have to be noisy or brave. It surprised me how quickly Ethan and Lila disappeared from the city. The paper said Lila left for Boston, a job with a new firm, her name mentioned only in passing as a cautionary example. Ethan stayed for a while, but not long. The last I heard, he'd moved south, something about a real estate partnership that never really took off. He never called. I watched for his car sometimes, half expecting to see it turn onto the street, some part of me still desperate for a sign, an apology, a chance at repair. But the only message was the empty silence he left behind. There were days I hated what I'd done. Days I'd wake from dreams of Ethan as a boy. His laughter, the weight of him asleep on my chest, the way he'd clung to my hand at the county fair when he was 6. I would wonder if there had been another way, a path through the anger and betrayal that didn't end in ruin. Sometimes I blamed Linda for leaving too soon, for trusting me to do right by him. Sometimes I blamed myself for loving too hard or too blindly. It was easier some days to blame fate. But then there were mornings when the sun broke through the windows in a way I hadn't seen in years, the light falling on the old wood floors, the warmth settling into my bones. I would stand in the kitchen, coffee steaming, and feel the weight in my chest ease, just a little. Justice isn't clean. It doesn't fix what's broken, doesn't restore what's lost. But it gave me back my own name, my own future. I didn't stay long in the house after the trial. I knew it was only a shell now, the heart of it gone with Linda and the family we tried to build. Selling it was easier than I thought. The realtor was kind, gentle with the details, understanding about the price. I packed what mattered into 2 suitcases. A few photos, Linda's favorite scarf, Margot's legal pad full of notes. The rest I left behind, memories for someone else to uncover. With the money, I paid off every debt. I made a donation in Linda's name to the cancer ward at the local hospital, enough to cover a year's worth of care for families who couldn't afford it. Margot suggested a trip, anywhere, she said, anywhere but here. I let her pick the place. We chose Paris because Linda had always wanted to see it, and because life is too short to wait for perfect timing. The city was nothing like I expected. It was louder, brighter, somehow smaller than the dreams we'd had. But walking the streets with Margot, watching the Seine flash silver in the morning light, I felt a strange gratitude, a sense of having survived something enormous. There were still days when the grief threatened to swallow me, when I'd see a father with his son and feel a sharp ache in my chest. But there were other days too, days when I laughed so hard my sides ached, days when the future felt wide open and full of promise. Margot and I grew close, not in the way people expect, but in the quiet, careful way that only comes from shared battles and mutual respect. We talked about everything and nothing, the pain of old wounds, the odd joys of freedom, the stubborn hope that maybe we weren't finished after all. She called her daughter in Los Angeles, left a message. I mailed Ethan a postcard, just a blank card with a picture of the Eiffel Tower. I didn't write much, just a simple, You know where to find me if you want to try again. Dad. I never knew if he read it. Maybe that was for the best. Life settled into something almost peaceful. Margot and I traveled, sometimes together, sometimes alone. I learned to cook badly. I learned to sleep without fear. Sometimes I missed the old pain, the sense of purpose that came with a fight. Other times I was glad to let it go. I watched the seasons change through strange windows in new cities. I found comfort in routine, in small kindnesses, in the way the world keeps turning no matter what you've lost. Looking back, I don't know if I'd do anything differently. Maybe that's the price of living long enough to see your own story through, knowing that every choice carries both loss and possibility. I know there are those who think I went too far, that I should have forgiven or looked the other way. Maybe they're right. Maybe justice isn't always fair. But I also know that I stood up for myself when it mattered, that I refused to be erased, that I honored Linda's memory the only way I knew how. Some nights, as the city outside hummed with its own secrets, I'd sit by a window, Margot asleep in the next room, and watch the lights fade one by one. I'd think of Ethan, of Lila, of all the people who'd come and gone. I'd think of Linda's voice, gentle and certain, telling me to keep going. And I would, because in the end, that's all any of us can do. Keep going, keep hoping, keep living with what's left and what's possible.